Lustful Zeus entered into the world one day, the world of humanity, came and walked upon the earth, and there he saw Gaia herself stretched out asleep upon a rock. And Zeus, being Zeus, not one to let a chance pass him by, even where that chance was a sleeping woman, a sleeping goddess, crept up upon her and gazed longingly at the beauty of her form, her long and luscious hair, her beautiful face, her breasts, her thighs, the swell of her hips. He yearned for her. And he became more and more excited, just sitting and watching and admiring and hovering his hands slightly sweatily over the sleeping goddess. And just as he was about to pounce upon poor Gaia, she rolled over, stretching in her sleep the way one will, and shifted position, and Zeus's pounce landed not upon the prone goddess, but upon the rock on which she had been sleeping, and he experienced what we might call a bit of divine premature manifestation all over the rock, which sank into the rock. Well, Gaia, hearing the thump of him landing, woke up and saw what he was about, and no doubt with a few choice words and expressions of disgust, stormed away. And Zeus, muttering and grumbling and moaning and snarling about his thwarted attempts, in his turn stole away in the other direction. But what of the rock, you might ask, or you might not. But if you did ask, that rock, stained with the divine emissions of Zeus, became what I'm not sure if pregnant is quite the right word, given that a rock doesn't actually have a womb. But something magical, something transformative, something strange and peculiar happened within that rock, and there emerged over the course of time from that rock something equally strange and equally peculiar and equally divine, a being who was both male and female at the same time, having the parts of both in arrangements about their body. A being with Zeus for a father and a rock for a mother, if mother is indeed the right word to apply to a rock. But this entity, Agdistis, grew and flourished with the magic coursing through its veins. Became a being of wisdom, a being of passion, a being of knowledge, without benefit of doting parents raising and tending young Agdistis. Nonetheless, the child flourished and grew to adulthood over the course of many years, and explored the world and came to learn of not only the land in which it had been born, which not at that point was called Turkey, but one day in the far future would be called Turkey, but came to learn of many other places too, and on travels and exploration came back to the great mountain that would one day bear the name of Agdistis. And there presented a problem to the gods themselves, who had observed the journeying of this man-woman, this being of two sexes, and had fretted and worried and felt that Zeus, through his somewhat hasty and inadvisable actions, had brought into the world a being who in some way disrupted the divine order. That being should be one thing or another, but not both at the same time. Although there are tales from the ancient times of beings that were both male and female at the same time. But for whatever reason, and who can know the minds of the Olympians, the gods had decided this was a step too far, and that something would have to be done before this being Agdistis should breed. And how and in what way would that work? Would Agdistis become a father by a woman, or become a mother by a man, or both? The debate raged on in Olympus until it was decided. No one is quite sure whether Dionysus decided this unilaterally, quite by himself, or whether he was sent on a mission, perhaps by Zeus, perhaps by the whole pantheon. But descend he did to earth, to that mountain where the being had been born, and was now resting after a time of travel and adventure, and sleeping upon a rock, maybe even that very rock from which Agdistis had been born. And there, as silently and stealthily and sneakily as Dionysus could manage, he went up with what is said to be a rope, but might well have been steel wire, a metal wire of some sort, perhaps, and knotted one end around the ankle of Agdistis, who was all huddled up in fetal form, snoring away upon the rock, and then formed a loop from the other end of this wire or cord or whatever it may have been, and, not to put too fine a point upon it, looped the other end around the male set of genitalia, around Agdistis's penis, and pulled it not painfully tight, but just tight enough, and it was a slip knot. And then Dionysus returned back to Olympus, not wishing to stay around and see his handiwork pay off. For when poor Agdistis woke up, stretching and yawning the way anyone will, and tried to stand up, the foot went one way, the slip knot tightened, and off came the male member. Agdistis had quite inadvertently emasculated themselves, had sliced off the member as Dionysus had planned, and the blood gouted everywhere. Agdistis screamed and hollered and howled, as you might well imagine anyone would who had just sliced off their own genitals, or half their own genitals in this case. And as the great gout of blood splattered, arcing over the rock that had been a bed a matter of moments beforehand, and splattered upon the soil, as is so often with divine and magical blood that splatters upon Greek earth. Whilst poor old Agdistis was off rolling and screaming and ripping and tearing and trying to staunch the flow of blood with clumps of moss and who knows what else, from that initial blood stain, blood splatter, there began to emerge green shoots that grew and grew and grew. And over the course of time, those green shoots grew with divine speed into an almond tree. And it may be, for all we know, the very first almond tree to enter into existence. And that fallen flesh was wrapped around by the growing shoots and became part of the almond tree, unseen by any other, unfindable, even if Agdistis had been able to put it in an ice pack and carry it towards a surgeon with a handy needle and thread. It was no longer to be found once the tree had claimed it for its own. But Agdistis, being of divine nature, did not bleed to death, as most humans would have done in that sort of a circumstance. Being this, perhaps not quite god, maybe demigod, maybe a daimon, this being eventually healed and staunched the flow of blood, and although perhaps always in a degree of pain, both mentally, I'm sure, and physically, survived. And as the healing took effect over the passage of many, many months, was able to turn to a fuller life, to travel, to visit, to go places, to meet people. Now, Agdistis was entirely female. And one day, some years later, she encountered a woman passing up the mountainside. But not a human woman, nor a divine woman, nor a woman of Olympus. This was Nana, the spirit of one of the rivers that flows through what one day would be called Turkey. These water spirits can travel a little distance from their river, exploring and examining, not too far or they begin to fade away, but they can wander a little. And Nana was wandering up the mountainside as Agdistis was going down the mountainside, and they hailed each other and thought no more of it, at that time at least. And where Agdistis was going, who can say, but Nana stopped underneath the shade of an almond tree, now a fully grown, fully flourished almond tree in full nut. And having shaded herself after the walk in the warm sun, breathed in that wonderful aromatic scent of the almonds and looked at the nuts and wondered, oh, I wonder what might they taste of, and began to gather some of them in her skirt. But as she was reaching up and plucking down and putting them in her skirt, one of them fell down her cleavage. And she thought, oh, well, I'll get that out later when I'm back down at the river. And off she wandered back down to the river and eating the almonds as she went. And finally she arrived at the river's edge, her river's edge, and she dangled her feet in herself, if you see what I mean, and began to unbutton the clothing she was wearing, searching in her cleavage for the missing almond, but it was not to be found. And she thought at the time to herself, well, it must have just kind of slipped through her bodice and dropped upon the ground somewhere. But it hadn't. That almond had absorbed into her very flesh, into the watery being of the nymph's nature, and impregnated her. Beware of eating almonds. 9 months rolled past, and Nana grew and grew and grew, pregnant with a child, and eventually she gave birth to a baby boy, whom she named Attis. And Attis grew with the rapidity of a magical child, which he was, spawn of a water nymph and a tree that had once been part of a mountain nymph, a mountain being, a mountain diamond, a demigod. And he was achingly handsome, stunning, catwalk handsome. He could have been on the cover of Vogue if Vogue had only existed back then. He was breathtakingly handsome. Even as a young man just starting in puberty and going out into the world, women turned their heads, men turned their heads, goats turned their heads. People looked at him and thought, oh, when he's a little older, he will be just divine. Not realizing, of course, that he was just divine. And as the years added on and he filled out and he acquired stature and his cheekbones that you could go skiing on, they were so sharp, and eyes you could drown in beautiful brown eyes like a puppy dog's, that you just, oh, and a smile that could warm the coldest heart and stir the deadest loins. He was glorious. Princesses from far and wide, and quite a few princes from far and wide, were throwing their undergarments at him and begging their fathers, please marry me off to Attis. Let it be, let there be a union between our kingdoms. Instead of getting married off to all these fat, ugly, awful old princes here, there and everywhere, let it be Attis. Well, as I say, Attis had this effect on many. And one day Attis was wandering up into the mountains of Agdistis, completely unaware that he had a rather peculiar relationship to the spirit of that mountain, that had been born of the rock of the mountain. And there was Agdistis, now female in body, if not necessarily in mind, who saw him, and though much older, of course, than this stunning young man, fell deeply, madly in love with the beautiful Attis, wanted Attis for her own. And whether anything happened or not, we shall have to draw a veil, because is it incest? Was Agdistis the father, the mother, the source? Is there language to describe what happened? Are there concepts to understand quite how all of these beings relate to one another, but that they are related, and that, generally speaking, it's probably advisable not to do such naughty things with your relatives? We will draw a veil over whether or not anything more than longing looks and heaving bosoms and lustful sighs were exchanged. But when word reached the king, even, of Pessinos, the local kingdom, that handsome Attis, whom he had been planning to marry off to his own daughter Zoe as part of an alliance, a political alliance, much to the sheer joy and glee of young Zoe, when he heard rumour that the being up the mountains had formed an attachment to this young man, and was often to be seen wandering, longingly gazing after this young man, and instigating conversations with this young man, and stroking his hair and patting his shoulder and other things. You see, Midas, the king of Pessinos, was in the know. He should be, given his family background, in the know of strange and unusual things that happened with the spirits and beings of the Greek mountains. He ordered Attis to have nothing more to do with that peculiar entity that lived up the mountains, that the date of the wedding would be set for 1 month hence. No rushing about. Normally royal weddings are years in the planning. Grand, great big state affairs. But no, Midas said the wedding to Zoe must be soon, before anything else happens. And he did not go into details, but he wanted this problem taken care of, and there's nothing like a wife to shackle the chastity belts and keep her husband at home and away from strange mountain spirits that might come groping in the night. Well, the wedding date was set, and of course news carries round towns and cities and villages and up mountainsides very rapidly of royal weddings and such grand do's and affairs, especially when they're so quick. And people start to think, is she pregnant? What's going on? Why is it so quick? Is it this reason? Is it that reason? None of them guessing the actual reason why it was so quick. And word reached the mountain spirit, who was distraught. This glorious boy, this handsome young man who could not ever be surpassed by any other man. There was no one more handsome in the world than this glorious beast. To be taken, snatched away from her, removed from her embrace, from her kisses, her caresses, her gazing, to be whisked off to a life in palaces, away from mountain seclusion. She was distraught, and just as one part of her anatomy had already been ripped, so it felt as if her heart was being ripped. The day of the great wedding came about. Guests from far and wide turned up, the rich and the great and the powerful and good and the wise and the not so good and the not so wise. And all of the servants serving the banquets and the priests conducting the ceremonies, the works took place. And there was the blushing bride, the beautiful and naive Zoe, who was as in love with Attis as any young woman ever could be. And there was Attis himself, looking like $1,000,000. Not that they had dollars back then, but anyway, looking wonderful. And all of the guests jovial and a little bit suspicious as to what the rush was about, but that kind of adds to the spice of the wedding. Once you've been to one royal wedding, you've been to them all. So if there's any kind of novelty value to be had, then that is a bit of a soupçon. When there came the uninvited guest, the doors of the palace opened, and Agdistis, feeling drained being away from the mountain, but coming nonetheless, entered the palace. Grieving, raging, fuming, weeping, resenting, hating, yearning, a seething cauldron of emotions, constantly bubbling and conflicting each with the other. And as Agdistis walked the hall, the riven madness within seeped, leaped, danced, exploded out, affecting all of the other guests. Every man in that hall, the rich and the servants alike, snatched up daggers and knives from their tables and the banqueting tables and hacked their own nether regions off and dropped the knives as they writhed, screaming and bleeding upon the floor. And all of the women likewise snatched up knives and daggers from the table and hacked and ripped and tore at their chests, cutting off their breasts that fell to the floor, and that blood flowed and that gushed everywhere, and those poor women fell screaming and howling and bleeding to the floor. And it was only when Attis himself and the poor beautiful Zoe, the last of the people at the great banqueting hall, also fell to this madness, this curse, and ripped their own bodies apart, that Agdistis stopped and saw her beloved on the floor, inches from death, blood fountaining everywhere, and howled to the heavens, begging forgiveness for this act of madness that had wrought so much carnage. For whilst mountain spirits might survive such things, other beings cannot. Almost everyone in that hall bled to death. The odd one or two might have survived horrendously disfigured and in agony for the rest of their lives, but almost everyone else died. Attis himself was moments from death. And as Agdistis, cradling his near corpse, carried it out of the great banqueting hall back towards the mountain, howling to the heavens, called to Zeus, called to all of the gods, all of the Olympians, for aid, for forgiveness, not so much for herself, but asked the dying youth, this glorious man in her arms, be preserved forevermore, never to rot, never to decay, never to shrivel or be eaten by worms and flies and maggots, but to be as beautiful in death as a corpse can be. And the gods, perhaps feeling a little guilty for having set this chain of events in motion in the first place, granted that wish. And Agdistis buried the corpse within her own mountain, within herself, her own flesh, her own stone and her own soil and her own roots, buried it within the shade of the almond tree, so that the roots of the almond tree, instead of draining the vital minerals and essences of the corpse, instead cradled it and held it deep within the earth. And whenever Agdistis wants to go and look upon the face of Attis, she comes to the roots of the tree and whispers those ancient magical words, and the soil moves back and the roots move back, and there is the face and the form and the shape of Attis, almost perfect except for the fatal wound, untouched by the passage of time, undevoured by the hunger of worms and maggots and flies. And as far as we know, the great being of the mountain moons over Attis still to this very day. Thank you.